they're just like we're getting together now to talk about issues, to talk about good practice, to learn from each other, to help make our organisations better, and help people to be safer, which I thought was quite useful. As today, I believe, is World Safety and Health Day. So about promoting safety in the workplace. So I thought this would be really useful. So as a group, we set up just after the Lecknell House disaster, but which happened back in 2009. We've currently got 260 plus members across England and Wales, which are social housing providers, arm length organisations, councils, housing associations, which we represent over 3 million homes from that membership. And our role really is to encourage that good practice and to share learning and to influence national policy. So when government come up with ideas and thoughts, we want to make sure that we represent our sector in the best way, and to make sure things can be delivered safely. We work with lots of different organisations. A few of those organisations are on the slides, just to give you a range of the type of organisations and partners we work with. This is really important because I am a founding member of the organisation, but I only chaired the organisation more recently, and I wanted to make sure that we had all the right people around the table to try and affect change, because sometimes we need more than just a few people getting together to try and influence that change. So that's a bit about us. We've got a website. It's called firesafetyandhousing.org.uk. Please feel free to go and have a look. Some basic information about who we are and what we do. And if you work in the housing sector space and or provide residential accommodation in any form, then please check us out. And we're also on LinkedIn as well, so you can follow us there. So today is quite important because there's a few things happening certainly in the next few weeks in terms of changes to legislation, which I'm going to sort of come on to. But I guess you're all wondering, what are the 3 C's? I know for those who operate in the health and safety sphere may recognise that phrase, but slightly different at the moment. So a second, slides have stopped working. 1 second. Okay, so here we go. The 3 C's: culture change, commitment, and collaboration and cooperation. These for me are the 3 key themes at the moment. For anyone that's been involved in housing, saw the devastating impact of Grenfell Tower back in 2017. We're just coming up to the 5th anniversary now, and it's still, every time I hear about it and see it or watch the inquiry testimony, it just, really pushes me to try and help colleagues to sort of do better and make sure that we can deliver things safer for, whether that be residents or staff, employees in workplaces. It's about driving that change and working together to do that. But you can only do those things and drive culture change if you've got those other things, that commitment there, from senior leaders, from staff. It's that joined up approach to things. In collaboration, and more recently, we're focusing a lot around what happened at Grenfell, but residents felt they weren't listened to, and so we've got to build that trust again. We've got to show people that actually we do care. We do want to make sure buildings are safe, and we want residents to be safe too. So the really important areas that we should focus on really, and talk to people to take them on that journey with us. Now, in practice, that's quite significant. There's two big pieces of legislation around this. The first is the Building Safety Bill. The second is the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, which we know about. This is the main piece of legislation that came into force since 2006, and requires organisations to carry out fire risk assessments, to provide emergency arrangements, to assess fire risk in buildings. But that's quite wide ranging, and it's a secondary piece of legislation that guides people on what to do, a bit like the Health and Safety at Work Act. But as we can clearly see on the slide here, in my world, and I've worked in, I started my career in logistics, and I ended up falling into housing purely by chance. And I've been in the housing sector now 12, 13 years now. Absolutely love it because it gives me so much challenge, because there's different risks, a variety of different risks. But clearly coming from a commercial point of view, where you're thinking about warehouses or factories or offices, to residential buildings where you've got completely different risks. You have people sleeping as where you don't in commercial situations. So you can see how the legislation is written in that way to guide people, with relevant guidance to ensure that risks are being managed and that we can keep people safe. But what's quite interesting, certainly for me in the housing sector, is that sometimes those things on their own are quite easy to manage because you can apply that process. But when it gets a little bit more complex, when those things come together and you find that you've got commercial properties with residential properties above, then it gets a bit more challenging in terms of, how do you manage the risk? What standards do you apply? What approach do you take? Is that enough? Are we still going to keep people safe? So these are all the questions that I tend to ask myself when I'm looking at risk. But you can see the variety of different settings and different risks that are there. Now that's the same in the housing sector. The difference is that the focus has been more on tall buildings at the moment because of what happened at Grenfell. But there have been other types of fires in lots of other buildings, some commercial, some residential, and so it's important that we try and learn lessons from those events to make sure in the future that we can still deliver safe environments, really. So I just wanted to share that sort of picture, really, in terms of it can get quite complex and quite confusing. But the important thing is that as long as you understand the principles of managing risk, then that should set you on the right path, really. What we do know is that there's some change coming. So today, the Building Safety Bill, which has been progressing through Parliament, is going to receive royal assent, I believe, today, which means that will become law. Now, obviously, there'll be some time to allow certain provisions to come into force. That hasn't been confirmed yet, but we think that will happen today. What we also know is that the Fire Safety Act, which did pass in the Houses of Parliament back on the 29th of April last year, It received royal assent then, but up until now, that legislation has not been enacted because various things needed to happen, including guidance being written to support the rollout of the Fire Safety Act. And I'm going to sort of touch on that briefly, just in terms of what the key changes are. But what we do know is that that legislation is due to be launched by government, we believe, around May the 12th. So just after local elections. We understand that that the announcements will be made then, with new guidance coming out. So you know, if you do have responsibilities for fire safety and managing buildings or managing workplaces, it'll be important to sort of put that date in your diary and you know, follow what's happening with that as it comes into force. So what is the Fire Safety Act? What does it do? It effectively is going to expand the scope of the fire safety order, which will now include any buildings with 2 or more sets of domestic premises. So if you, for argument's sake, if you've got a commercial row of shops and there's more than 2 residential units above those shops, then that will form part of that, and will require responsible persons to assess and reduce the risk of fire posed by the structure and the common parts of the building. Now, this is the important bit, because the fire safety order already applies to those buildings individually. The difference is that now the structure of that building will now form part of that assessment. And so this will include anything above 18 meters. Some things will come in at 11 meters, which is 4 stories, but the majority this applies to is for 18 meters, so taller buildings, and structure will include the external walls, any cladding, any insulation, any of the fixings that attach the cladding to the building, windows, and also balconies, and all front flat entrance doors between domestic premises and the common parts. And this is quite a different change, because before, where you had leaseholders that were responsible for their flat front door, it was always difficult. Sometimes they would change that door. It might not be a fire door, and that may put others at risk. And it was always a challenge in the sector to tackle that. But now, with the new legislation, that will effectively bring that under the responsibility of the responsible person. So that will be coming into legislation. You know, future regulation, there's also some changes in the fire safety order where the Secretary of State will be able to amend the order and apply that to other buildings in the future. So there'll be a power to do that. And then also on a separate note, previously, you know, if you were following guidance, that didn't, you know, if you ended up in court and you were trying to defend yourself, unless that guidance was published under Article 50, there would be an issue with whether that guidance was sufficient to demonstrate compliance. And so there's been some changes to Article 50 that now says if guidance is produced, you can use that to defend, but that can also be used against you if you fail to follow it. So that's quite an important legal change. And then also what they're bringing in through that act will be a number of secondary legislation that's going to implement the phase 1 Grenfell recommendations, which I'll come on to briefly. Amongst all of that will be a change to, so previously fire risk assessors, for example, didn't need a qualification. So, you could set up as a fire risk assessor tomorrow, go on a 2-day course or a week's course, and then set up as a fire risk assessor and start fire risk assessing. We don't think that's right. We think people need to have the right level of competence to do that. And government have finally recognised that. And there's going to be some changes around that the fire risk assessor will need to demonstrate competence, which hopefully should help to improve the standard of fire risk assessment out there in the future. Competence is such a big area. I sit on the HSE Interim Industry Competence Committee, which has been recently set up under the Building Safety Regulator. So I'm helping to shape and influence what that might look like in the future. I've also sat on some of the competence steering group working groups that were set up after the Hackett review into building safety. And what you see on the screen right now is a snapshot of that framework, which was originally designed for building safety managers, but more recently that role has been removed from the bill and scrapped. So, but the work that we've done is still relevant. It still demonstrates the things that we think people need to understand building safety management. So if you're managing a workplace or you're managing a residential building, we think these are the sort of key things that you need. And we could quite easily map this across to the competence framework, which I think we'll be doing at the end of the presentation. And but it just gives you a flavour for some of the things that we think people need to, in terms of knowledge and skills, to be able to deliver safer buildings. And this is everything from knowing about how a building operates, to how to manage risk, to the relevant leadership, and really how do you deliver that, in practice. How do we manage fire doors? How do we manage evacuations in those types of premises, etc. Lots have been talking about external walls because obviously the cladding focus. There is some new guidance out called PAS 9980. So if anyone does have any buildings that are 18 metres and above, this is the latest guidance to be produced, and it's a 2-stage process to it, but it's geared to fire engineers and others, but it can be a useful read if you've got those type of buildings. Fire doors, under the fire safety order, one of the recommendations from the Grenfell inquiry was that flat front doors or fire doors should be checked every 3 months to make sure that the self-closing devices were working. And for those that remember, self-closing devices were one of the issues that where they weren't in place, they weren't working, and that allowed the fire and smoke to spread. So the latest indication that we've got from government is that we believe that they're going to make some announcements on this on May the 12th. We think that that's only going to be 11 metres or above, so 4 or more stories, where annual checks of flat doors will be required, and that responsible persons will need to, what they deem as undertaking best endeavours to gain access. So government recognise, that sometimes access will be an issue because people will be out. If they're working all day, you won't always be able to gain access. Some people might not let you in. So these are some of the challenges that we face. So that will be coming in May. And we understand that anything below 11 metres is there won't be a legal requirement, but you still have duty of care, and you still need to make sure that people are safe. So so in the round, there'll still be a requirement to check fire doors regularly. How regularly will determine on what level of risk and the type of buildings that you have. Lots of talk about information for residents, but this could equally apply to commercial buildings too. It's about the end user. It's about, have people got the right level of information? Do they understand what they need to do? So if I go stop at a hotel, I'll have a look at the fire action notice on the back of the door, just familiarise myself. But I can do that. But for people that don't speak English as a first language or don't understand, there's different ways that we can communicate. Sometimes pictorial, sometimes words, sometimes a mixture of both. Again, that'll need to be considered. And more recently, there's been lots of issues around disabled people in evacuation around Peeps. Now, we think, in commercial settings, this has been around for years. If you have a disabled person, you put people in, you might have evac equipment on stairwells, that's happening, and that's fine in office environments. In residential, that's completely different. You don't have staff. There's no equipment currently provided. You could be getting people down one single staircase, and if firefighters are coming in, how do you tackle those challenges? But how do those people that can't get out, how do we keep those safe as well? So there's lots of different things around this. And whilst the legislation's talking about disabled persons on high-rise buildings, shouldn't we be having that conversation, thinking about that more in other settings as well? So just a challenge there, really, about just thinking about that. And it's important that residents understand what they can do, because sometimes I think the best way to do this is have a conversation with that individual, and just talk them through what you're trying to achieve, what they can do, because we think that that's the best way of doing it, is the disabled person will have the answers and the solutions because they know what works for them. So it's linked back to giving information to residents about working with people, that collaboration to achieve what we want to achieve. Lots of other things around still under review by government. These things haven't been finalised yet, and they are looking at these things like charging for false alarms, fees and charges, high-risk workplaces, Peeps. There's going to be another consultation coming out shortly around information for Peeps, and there's a bit more information there with the Gov website. So we'll share the slides afterwards. So feel free to check that information out if that will be helpful. Lastly, I think there's been a lot of talk recently around proportionality. So we talk about life safety risk, making sure that people can get out. But also the challenge about, are we doing asking the right questions? Are we being practical enough? Just because it is going to cost too much money, is there other things that can we do? How do we balance that? How do we make sure that we're doing the right things proportionately, in relation to the risk, and is that enough? So yeah, it was just throwing that sort of challenge out really around risk and proportionality, and to make sure that we can keep people safe. And that's it from me. I just then want to just open up now for any questions, and I'll stop sharing. Back to the chair.
Get off mute. Thank you very much. We've got one from Angela. Angela, do you want to ask it?
Oh, thank you, Keith. Yeah. I just said social housing board that came from health and safety as well. That's where my career in health and safety started. Facilities sort of transformed to health and safety years and years and years ago. I think I was 20 years in social housing, and now I've been sort of several years on my own as a consultant. But I mean, back in those days, we noted and we tried to do some work on the fact that housing officers were doing an awful lot of inspections and advising tenants, residents, sheltered housing people, when they took them into the properties, advising them on fire, and they didn't have the knowledge. They'd bring maintenance inspectors in if needed, fine, but they had all these checklists to do, and they didn't really have the competencies to do those fire checklists and inspections properly. Has there been any more developments in that you know of in the last sort of 10 years or so?
Yeah, I think, you know, I talked briefly about the competent steering group about after the Hackett review, and there were a number of working groups that were set up directly afterwards, 13 working groups in all, looked at different roles that operate within residential. So everything from fire risk assessors to fire engineers to contractors to building safety managers, you know, etc. So that was to try and understand the level of competence in each of those areas based on those roles. So there's been a massive piece of work done around that to try and pull together this sort of high level competence work to encourage organisations to start thinking about this. And so, you know, I think the fire risk assessor approach has changed. You know, that we've now got 3 registers. There's lots of different types of training out there that can get people on that path. And I think the pathway is a little bit clearer than what it was 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. I think there's still a lot of confusion though around that. And I think, you know, for housing officers, yeah, absolutely, it's about educating them. I think we've got some really good fire safety teams within organisations and fire professionals that help to share and raise that awareness in organisations. If you know, if that doesn't already sit within the health and safety remit, you know, it's an important part. So I think there's still a lot to do. You know, I'm still heavily involved in lots of conversations around competence because we still think that, you know, we've really got to change this so that there's a more organisational approach to competence, you know, because it's not always just about the competent person that's been employed. It's about how other staff within the organisation can also play their part to do that, you know. So if they're going out to visit sites and they see something that's not quite right, you know, there's processes and mechanisms in place so that can be dealt with. And then you've got the right expertise and the right levels of knowledge and skills in the organisation to do that.
I think there's also that the housing officers will know their individual tenants and they'll know if they've got disabilities, frailties, other mobility issues. That means that they can't, you know, and situations change as well. You know, they might be on an upper floor and suddenly something changes, which means they can't evacuate. And it's very difficult in social housing to house them into the right level accommodation or anything. It doesn't just change like that. But, you know, I think the housing officers were the ones that were on the ground, the ones that could tell you more, but they didn't have the competencies to understand, to be able to do not a fire risk assessment, but the checklist level, you know, the inspection level. Yeah, thank you. That's lovely.
Okay, Angela, no problem.
Okay, Paul Westwood put a question in the chat. Who will be deciding who is qualified, and will there be a set group of qualifications that will be acceptable to be deemed qualified to complete fire risk assessments?
It's a really good question, Paul. And I think the answer to that is you know, I tend to, because when I operate in the competence space, and there's lots of people that tend to just default to what training or what qualifications do I need. And so for me, fire risk assessors is or others is about, it's not just about doing the training. It's important that we've got the right products out there in the marketplace to make sure that we can do training and get that knowledge, but it's also about how we then apply it and how we check how that gets checked and how you learn from that, and so ultimately the organization that you work for will be responsible. As the responsible person, they will need to make sure they're employing qualified, competent individuals like that, and as we move forward, certainly with the high risk buildings, there's going to be a new safety case regime that's going to come into place. And so the onus will be on the organization to demonstrate they've got a competent workforce to the building safety regulator. So, but for lower risk buildings, that's about, making sure that staff have got the right level of qualifications, and that, there are a couple of registers for fire risk assessors. There are pathways to do that. There's different courses that you can do. I think I don't think there's a specific qualification that you should do, but I think it's about making it relevant to what buildings you're risk assessing against. So, you can do a NEBOSH fire certificate, for example, which is sort of level 3. And, if you're just risk assessing commercial offices, your workplace, for example, and you've done that and, you've done that for a bit, that might be absolutely fine. But that doesn't necessarily make you competent to risk assess a tower block, because you need a different set of competencies relating to the risks associated with that type of building. It's a bit like a driving license almost. So, you build that up over time, which is why we do CPD and lifelong learning about, we pick these different things up that helps us to make us more competent at what we do. And the key is knowing where that line is, knowing at what point am I not competent, and being able to have those characteristics to say, no, I'm not going to do that because I'm not competent in that. But I do know where to go to get that competence, and that's the important thing.
So, from a purely personal point of view, somebody, I do a lot of construction side. So, which side of that would then push through in order to push the designers to improve their design right from the beginning? Bearing in mind that Grenville was a cracking example of where the designer clearly didn't understand the requirements of the building.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the working groups that I was talking about earlier, there was a designers group. So they've been having lots of conversations about how we can improve that side of things. And I think for me, the client is ultimately responsible for making sure that, the learning that we get from managing those types of buildings feed into new projects, so that, we know what the hazard, what the issues are. So, if we're talking to housing officers on the ground, where they just, doing local inspections and going, I wish they hadn't done this, because they put high ceilings in, and it's like, the maintenance guys are going, well, now I've got to get a cherry picker to get up there, and actually we can if we put LED lighting in, it'll be better because we don't have to maintain it as much. Thinking about how we the sort of different level of controls that we put in, and how they can be most effective. And I think it's how we feed that back into new design projects. And I think sometimes that link isn't always there. that learning from people on the ground back into design stage.
Definitely, I think new and novel products get it put into buildings without any thought for actual maintenance or their use within the wider communities. So very much with you on that one.
Yeah, definitely.
I have one question come in sort of anonymously. The Welsh Government, apparently, are they responsible for the devolve thing? Because apparently they have issued guidance.
Yes, they have. So yes, obviously in Wales, it's devolved administration. So Wales have published new guidance around the fire safety order. So there are differences. And yeah, I think that was published not long ago, actually, 2 or 3 months ago. So there is guidance out there. I can send the links out afterwards so you've got that information.
Yes, please, that'd be good, especially being a South Wales branch.
October. Oh, thanks, Sarah.
Have you got the link, Sarah, that you could publish? Save Andrew doing it then.
Brilliant. Thank you.
That would be excellent. As one just come in from John Brown, with regards to competencies versus experience with PD role, is this being asked? Someone will have to agree who has correct skills, knowledge, experience, so that questions are there to competence to make assessment.
Yes. So yes, behaviours more recently has become more relevant. I think as part of the work that we talked about. So historically, we always used to talk about skills, knowledge, experience, and I know the HSE, for example, would refer to behaviours, but wouldn't necessarily consider behaviours as a competence. And it's only more recently that we've seen where negative behaviour has had an impact on delivering safer buildings. So it's important that that's recognised, I think, and it is a balance. And ultimately, what we did was during that work, we published a self-assessment tool for building managers. So which set out a self-assessment model that effectively was based on the nuclear competence framework. And in terms of risk, you can't get much higher really than the nuclear. But so we use that as a baseline to develop a model that organisations could start to think about how they assessed competence in their organisation and gave consideration to behaviours. But in terms of that, in terms of the PD role, I think it's not my sort of area of expertise, design, but I think the principles are the same really, in terms of making sure that we do think about behaviours, because someone can do the qualification, get the experience, maybe be able to do that really well, but if they haven't got the right attitude or the right levels of behaviours, integrity and things like that, then that competence is not much use, because they're not also doing the right things either. So it is a balance.
Yeah. I know for the principal design side, I mean, I know REBA have now introduced a mandatory fire section into their skills portfolio. So anybody who goes through REBA now has to actually partake in that unit, which is quite interesting. I suppose that helps with that principal designer role to an extent. But yeah, how it then gets rolled out further, it'd be interesting to see how the take up for it is.
Yeah,
I think the FPA are also doing some stuff as well, aren't they, on the design stuff?
Yeah.
So hopefully we should see that maybe in May. Ian Davis has put another one in the chat. Is a stay put fire emergency action plan really the best way to keep people safe in high-rise flats?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I guess the correct answer should be, well, that depends based on what your risk assessment says. But you know, I do think that, you know, just sticking an action plan on a wall, telling people to stay indoors, in reality, in this day and age, given all the events that have occurred, it's unrealistic to say that people are going to do that. But also, you know, have you got the confidence that your building is safe to operate stay put in the first place? You know, it's making sure that the compartmentation and that the building is being maintained in a way that is fit for purpose. You know, because, and there's a massive debate around stay put evacuation strategies at the moment, and I know there's government are doing stuff around this, and I know industry are doing some work around this to do some research in, you know, in terms of what the alternatives are. But you know, the bottom line is, if the building's not safe, then you can't operate stay put in that scenario. You know, there's guidance out there that tells you what you need to do. But likewise, you know, I think we've gone past the age of just sticking an action plan on the wall, even in commercial premises. You know, in a workplace, you know, you still got to, you might need to put those things for visitors, but you still need to be able to embed that in with employees or with residents. You know, you've got to keeping people up to date on that, you know, and reminding people about what to do in the event of a fire, because otherwise they forget, you know, and you don't just suddenly put a message out and say, yes, go and do X, because it won't always sink in. You know, and it's the catchy stuff that tends to sort of get people. But it's about doing that together. It's about having those conversations together, talking to staff, talking to residents, and making sure that ultimately, you know, we can keep people safe, and certainly in high-rise flats. You know, it's that collaboration about what works and what doesn't.
I think it's clear and consistent communication, isn't it? Whatever the message, you've got to be consistent and you've got to be clearly communicating it. And in times of emergency, people's communication tends to go downhill, and that then affects the outcomes. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've seen many a time where people have, you know, got into the ground floor of a high-rise block, stuck up the evacuation strategy into a notice board, and that's it. And that can't be acceptable now. You know, you know, we've got to communicate with residents and give them relevant information that's useful. And for me, you know, it's just about keeping that simple, really, and getting the key messages to everyone that knows what they need to do in the event of a fire.
okay. Jalal's just put one in the chat. Material in building is very important. What is the new legislation updates in regards to this, please?
Okay, so there's lots of things going on in this space. There's going to be a new construction products regulator that's just been brought in as part of the building safety bill. There's you know, a lot of tightening up around testing of products that's, you know, that's being developed. Again, I've not spent a lot of time on this in this space, but you know, the bill brings in those changes, and so it's going to take, you know, with some of those provisions, 18 months to come fully into force. But I know they are making some changes around this. They're also changing a few things around leaseholder provision and working with developers. You know, you've probably seen some of the news around you know, pledges from developers for the people that are constructing buildings are doing it right, and where they're not, that they hold to account. And you know, there's some changes to defective premises regulations as well, around the time period on how long you can it can take before you can't claim. So that, I think they're extending that to 30 years. So you know, lots of different changes in the space around materials, but it really important that, you know, as an end user, if you're having refurbishment work done, is that, you know, you're checking and you're asking the right questions, really, just to make sure that the whatever materials are being used are safe.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got no more questions in the chat. One last chance. If anybody's got any questions to ask. Nothing coming in. So,
Excellent.
opportunity to say thank you very much, Andrew. Very interesting. Really good presentation. Really informative, and thank you for all those who've asked questions in the chat. So,
Thanks, Chair.
okay, Paul, I believe it's the competence bit next, isn't it? It is. So, Martin, do you want to talk us through the competency wheel?
Right, thank you, Chair. Right, good afternoon, everyone. In line with our previous events, I will endeavour to give you a brief overview of how Andrew's presentation links with the Iosh competency framework. This may help you when recording your CPD and can assist when using the Iosh blueprint too, which in addition maps out your personal skills and is very useful in identifying gaps in your current knowledge base. This will assist in creating a development plan so that you can plan your training and CPD activities needed to achieve your goals or address any gaps in your current knowledge whilst dovetailing within the Iosh competency framework. So, when we consider today's event, I have identified the following areas that link with the competency framework. Firstly, looking at health and safety law, this requires an understanding of the compliance parameters in relation to fire safety law and the organization and policies / procedures that are in place and describe its intent and approach to fire safety. This includes those accountabilities, responsibilities, and arrangements for delivering a safe environment, which must be described and monitored throughout the life of the structure or building. So if we look at the principles of health and safety, we as safety professionals must be able to interpret what regulations and other legislative laws apply and identify potential problems and establish and instigate solutions. Okay, so how do we do that? Through the provision and delivery of information being fundamental in the establishment of safe environments. Okay, so that's captured the health and safety law aspect of it. If we now move on to look at culture, the fire safety professional is required to assess, manage, and reduce the risk of fire. So we again look at fire safety culture and its influence and how it's influenced by multiple factors and interactions with various stakeholders. Okay, so that's captured the cultural side of it. If we now move on to the next slide, please, Paul. Okay. So if we look now at the technical competencies, and in particular, managing health and safety risk. So here, we considered fire safety risks and how they could potentially impact stakeholders. Again, as Andrew outlined, does time, money, and effort exerted on the control of risks achieve the desired outcome? Here we were looking at that balancing act between the elephant and the mouse. Okay, so the next aspect we moved on to, how does that link into sustainability? The key aspect here lies in the question, can a health and safety culture be established which can be sustained in the long term? Okay, the question mark here is our cultural approach flexible enough to be future-proof when compared with the known proposed legislative changes that, again, Andrew outlined in his presentation? So if we can move on to the final slide. Here we looked at core competencies. So the first aspect of that is the strategy. This is central to any successful fire strategy and links into information management, emergency planning, monitoring and controlling. These are key to managing the perceived risks in the environment we're dealing with. Again, this may include gathering internal and external information in relation to such things or such factors as regulations, standards, and good practice to enable us to evaluate where we are and what more do we need to do to improve. Okay, moving on to the planning aspects that we looked at. Here we have an understanding the importance of leadership with an oversight of potential risk, while considering the needs and expectations of the multiple stakeholders, thus ensuring safety is delivered to those that are potentially at risk. The leadership aspects we looked at. As professionals, are we there to guide stakeholders by providing clear, helpful advice, which ensures compliance and a safe environment? Or, in addition, can we influence stakeholder behavior? We were looking at factors such as people with disabilities within the buildings, etc. And by demonstrating issues in the accommodation environment, can we pull together potential solutions? And on to the next slide. Okay, the final aspects we're looking at here, stakeholder management. This is a way of working that requires the safety professional to find out the stakeholders' needs and expectations. This entails building a rapport with all the stakeholders, a key element to safety, promoting information sharing, facilitating effective communication channels, and encouraging collaboration. Looking at communication itself, as Andrew outlined in one of his slides, it's an essential attribute in the ability to create simplicity out of complexity. So whatever the communication medium that we eventually select, we need to be mindful when delivering the messages to consider that what we want to convey and the most effective means of delivering that message to the recipients. Again, as Andrew outlined, he was looking to keep things simple. So it's clear advice and demonstration. The final point on my slides is working with others. What happens when the safety professional is not there? How are people going to react to situations? Information is key to developing a safe culture. We need to engage and establish a relationship with the stakeholders and explore those relationships. So in conclusion, thank you everyone, and I hope this has helped you in some way to link today's events to the Iosh competency framework. Whether you're recording your CPD or using this to update your development plan. And back to you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Ryan. It's very helpful. And we hope you've all enjoyed the session today. Thank you for taking time to attend. Thanks to Angela, the Irish governance team, especially Andrew for his presentation, and everyone else for sharing your knowledge and asking questions with us. We're looking forward to welcoming you at our next future meetings and moving forward with us as a branch. Please take time to complete the short post-event survey, as your feedback is truly valued and will be utilised to shape future events. And obviously that's available on the recording as well. Please stay connected and keep up to date. And there are the links. Thank you. Paul, are we going to stay on branch committee for a few minutes?
Yes, we can. Yeah, I'm just going to stop sharing the screen, but obviously I'll just stop the recording as well. So thanks to everybody for that. If everybody wants to stay on for a short networking session, we'll do that, but obviously we'll turn the recording off now. And so thanks for that.